So hello everybody, my name is Balazs. I am one of the postdocs at Imperial College's Center for Psychedelic Research. So here at this conference and elsewhere, there's a lot of discussion around the healing potential of psychedelics and how they might change the metaphysical worldview of people taking these substances. But here what I want to talk about is, I think, an often overlooked aspect of psychedelics, and that is that they raise very interesting scientific methodological issues as well. And really what I'm mostly going to talk about is this issue of blinding. And really what the problem is that the modern medical research is based on placebo-controlled, randomized controlled trials. And with these kind of studies, really the idea is that you are not telling your patients whether they are getting an inactive placebo or the active treatment that you're really trying to test. And you're not telling them because you do not want their expectations about the active treatment to interfere with the outcomes that you are going to measure later in the study. And these subjective biases are particularly relevant if you are working with subjective outcomes. So for example, with mood disorders is a very good example, which is often what we measure with psychedelic therapy. Now, this model works really well under certain circumstances, but they do not fit well with psychedelics, and there is a very simple reason for that, and that it's extremely easy to distinguish 200 micrograms of LSD from placebo. Like, just the vast majority of participants are going to have a pretty easy time figuring it out when they are in the active group and whether they are in the inactive group, based on the very strong subjective effects that these substances elicit. So because of that, this whole idea of double-blind, placebo-controlled studies just do not really fit well with psychedelics. But on the other hand, that's how the entire modern medical research infrastructure is set up. So we have this mismatch here. How can we evaluate the efficacy of psychedelic substances if the method that we trust the most is not really applicable to psychedelic medications? So that's the introduction. That's the problem that I want to talk about. And more specifically, what I'm going to do is that first I'm going to talk about macrodosing and reanalyzing a trial that came out from our team, and is the famous escitalopram versus psilocybin trial. So escitalopram is a classic SSRI. It's one of the most often prescribed SSRI medications in the UK, and I think generally in the world as well. So that was the paper that came out in 2021, so 2 years ago, in the New England Journal of Medicine. It made a lot of headlines. And what I'm going to do is to basically add into that analysis an adjustment for expectancy. So as you probably know, the trial results by and large favor psilocybin, but what happens if you're adding in expectancy to the equation? And then after that, I'm going to talk a little about some of the work that we are doing on microdosing, and specifically about the statistical pipeline of what happens, or actually not what happens, but like rather how can we incorporate blinding quality into the interpretation of the trials. And I'm going to bring it all together at the end a little bit. So that's roughly the outline of the talk. So first I'm going to tell you about the reanalysis of the PsiloDep2 trial, if we are adding expectancy into the statistical models. So very quickly, this was the structure of the trial. So there were 60 participants. They were randomly assigned either to the escitalopram arm or to the psilocybin arm in a 1-to-1 ratio. And the trial had a 6 weeks long treatment period. And during that 6 weeks, patients had to come into the clinic twice, 3 weeks apart. If you were in the psilocybin group, then on those 2 occasions, you got 25 milligrams of psilocybin, which is roughly equivalent to like 4 grams of dried mushrooms. So it's not like a super large dose, but it is like a higher end of a recreational dose, let's put it that way. So you got these 2 doses of psilocybin, and on top of that, you had daily capsules that you took when you did not go into the clinic, and all those capsules were placebos in this case. So that's the psilocybin group. The other group, the escitalopram arm, on those 2 occasions when they came into the clinic, they received the placebo, and their daily capsules were escitalopram, which is this classic SSRI medication. So you can see on this figure there were a bunch of time points, and for the purposes of this presentation, I'm just going to focus on the change from the baseline to the primary endpoint, which is 6 weeks out, so after the entire treatment period has elapsed. That's what we are going to examine here. So, what were the results of this trial? And this is a figure from the supplementary materials, but I think actually this is the one that captures what we saw the most. So, what happened with this trial is that most of the outcomes that relate to depression measures and mood, there was a statistically significant separation between psilocybin and escitalopram, and in all cases it favored psilocybin. However, there was one mistake, or however you want to put it, but the predefined primary outcome, what you see here on the top, the QIDS, which is the quick inventory of depressive symptomology, that happened to be a non-significant difference. And because of that, you can a little bit interpret the trial in any way you want. Because if you're somebody who is really against psychedelics, then you can say that, hey, on the predefined primary outcome, there was no separation. So this is a failed trial. Psilocybin is not really better than escitalopram. If you're somebody who is more favorable to psychedelics, then you can say that, okay, in this trial, we missed on the primary outcome, the QIDS, but look, on all of the secondary outcomes, psilocybin is clearly better than escitalopram. So you can take the interpretation either way that you want. Often what is done statistically when you have a situation like this, so when you have a large number of outcomes, is that you are doing a statistical procedure which is adjusting for multiple comparisons. I'm not going to go into the details, but the point is that is one way of incorporating that information into the trial analysis, that there was a number of outcomes. And for reasons that's not clear to me, that was actually not done in the main publication that was done in the New England Journal of Medicine. So this is the analysis that's in the original publication, and this one didn't have anything related to expectancy measures. However, when the paper was published, and very soon after, there were a number of letters to the editors and a number of articles, scientific articles, criticizing the trial that, hey, okay, it's great that you have these results, but let's be honest, this wasn't really a blinded trial, because it's very easy to distinguish the 25 milligrams of psilocybin, which is a strong psychedelic dose, from the placebo capsules. Now, typically, when you are interested in assessing whether patients were properly blinded or not, the way to do it is that when the treatment period is over, you ask them to take a guess. Hey, do you think you were in the placebo arm or in the active arm? Or in this case, were you in the psilocybin arm or in the escitalopram arm? And somewhat unfortunately, that was not done in this trial. So we do not have any hard empirical data to assess how well blinding worked or did not work. That being said, I think everybody from the Imperial team, myself included, is very comfortable saying that 99.9% that blinding did not work in this case, again, because of those very strong subjective effects that psilocybin elicits at this dose. It's extremely likely that the vast majority of participants figured out their treatment allocation. A few months ago, there was another big paper coming out from the NYU team when they treated alcohol use disorder with psilocybin, and in that case, they asked participants to take a guess. And I think it was 94% of the participants managed to figure out when they were in the placebo and when they were in the psilocybin arm. So that is again emphasizing that it's very easy to figure out which group you belong to with psychedelics. And so one thing that I forgot to mention, I think, is that so when you're asking this treatment guess, if patients are getting it right about 50%, that's when you know that your trial was properly blinded, because you would expect them to get it right about 50% just by chance. So if this correct guess rate is 50% or around 50%, then participants were genuinely blinded. In the case of macrodosing, at least at this NYU study, it was 94%, which is indicating that blind breaking was widespread in this study. One thing to note that in the NYU study, note it wasn't 100%. So there were a few people who got placebo and thought that they got psilocybin, and the other way around. Actually, if anybody here wants to do some qualitative research, I would be super interested to team up with the NYU team and follow up with those people with a qualitative interview and just to ask them about their experience. Why did they think it was psilocybin? Why they got placebo and the other way around? I think we might find some fascinating insights if we would do that. Okay, so as I said, the PsilODEP2 trial was widely criticized that it wasn't really a blinded study, and even though we didn't have any empirical data to assess the quality of the blinding, our team is happy to admit that it wasn't a properly blinded trial. However, the reason why we are doing the blinding, and keep this in mind as I go forward in the presentation, is to protect the trial results from the subjective expectancy effects. We are doing the blinding in order to eliminate expectancy biases. But one thing that we did have in this trial is a measure of pre-treatment expectancy. So what was patients' expectations both on psilocybin treatment and the escitalopram treatment? So this is the question that was asked, and this was at baseline. So this is before the treatment began. So it just says, please rate the following with regards to the prospect of receiving 6 weeks of daily escitalopram. At the end of the trial, after receiving escitalopram every day for 6 weeks, how much improvement in your mental health do you think will occur? And they had this slider that they had to move from 0% improvement to 100% improvement. So this was one of the questions. And then there was another question that was analogous to this one, but instead of referring to the 6 weeks of daily escitalopram, it was referencing the 2 moderately high doses of psilocybin. So we basically have 2 data points for each patient. One of them is their expectation regarding psilocybin therapy, and the other one is their expectation regarding escitalopram treatment. So the first thing that we did is that we just looked at, was there sort of an expectancy bias in this sample? And lo and behold, yes, patients by and large had much higher expectations for psilocybin therapy relative to escitalopram. Bear in mind, this was like pre-treatment, so this is before they would have received either a single dose of psilocybin or escitalopram. So I think this finding is probably the least surprising finding ever, because just by the nature of the trial, most of the patients who came into our clinic, they wanted to be in the psilocybin arm. Like, you know, there are like a number of depression trials going on all around London and UK and internationally, but a very few that has psilocybin treatment. So it was unsurprising that our patients were biased in this way. Okay, so we have this data, and then what happens if you incorporate this into your statistical models? And the way you do it is that you just add a correction term to the statistical model. And unfortunately, I don't have any like fancy figures for that, but I have this table with a lot of numbers that I'm going to walk you through. I don't have a laser pointer. I was expecting that, so I'm sorry about that, but I will just try to point out which column to look at. So first, you can see that we have these various depression-related measures on the left-hand side. And then you can see this table is actually composed of 2 tables. And you can see that if you look at the top row, you can see that first we have the models without adjusting for expectancy. So that is if you just look at the data as it is without considering the differential expectations that patients had for these 2 treatments. And then next to it, we have the models with the with adjustment for expectancy. And note that for both of these models, I actually give you like 2 set of p-values. One of them is the raw p-value, which is what you see here. And then the other one is the Bonferroni adjusted p-value. The Bonferroni adjustment is one method of doing this adjustment for multiple comparisons. So that is one way of overcoming the issue that we have a large number of outcome measures. And unless you are making this adjustment for multiple comparison, you might have false positive results, because sometimes you're going to get positive results just by chance. So if you look at this column with the regular p-value, this is what is basically in the New England Journal of Medicine paper, which is the main analysis of the paper. There is a statistically significant separation on 5 out of the 6 scales, basically on everything except the QIDS, which was the predefined primary outcome. And in all cases, the psilocybin is doing better than escitalopram. Now, if you look at this other part of the table, then you can see that the results are quite different. In particular, if you're also considering the adjustment for multiple comparisons. So if you're looking at this rightmost column, if you're looking at that, then actually we only have 2 outcomes that are significant. And Arguably, one of them is not really significant. If you are in statistics, you see a lot of memes that if you get a p-value of 0.049, then probably something dodgy is going on. So I like triple check, but it is really 0.049. So that is the true p-value there. But like arguably, that's probably we should consider that not being a hit. The point being is that just notice how easy it is to go from this column to this column. In this column, we are just looking at the data without adjusting for multiple comparisons and without considering expectancy. And 5 out of the 6 outcomes, there's a significant separation favoring psilocybin. If you're adjusting for multiple comparison and you adjust the statistical models for expectancy, then practically speaking, it's 1 out of the 6 outcomes is statistically significant. So if anybody tells you that science is objective, just always please remember that how easy it is to get a certain outcome. Okay, so as you can see, expectancy makes a lot of difference in how you interpret the outcome of the trial. But what was the mechanism behind it? And intuitively, one would think that probably what's going on is that patients in the psilocybin arm sort of like got like an extra placebo response because they had the high expectations for the psilocybin arm. They went into that first session at the clinic when they got the first dose of psilocybin. Everybody figured out that, hey, I'm a winner, I'm in that psilocybin group, and that helped them to feel better. That's the whole point of the placebo response. If you are expecting to feel better, that is sufficient to make you feel better. But somewhat surprisingly, that's actually not how it works. That's not how the mechanism of this bias is manifesting in the data. So what I'm showing you on this slide is an analysis of the expectancy within arm. So you can see that there are a bunch of, there are like 6 panels here, and each of the panels is corresponding to one of the outcomes. And on both of the panels, there are 2 lines. One of them, the blue one, that corresponds to the escitalopram arm, and the red one is for psilocybin. And what this shows that in the x-axis, you see that what was the pre-treatment expectation of the patients, and on the y-axis, you see how much change there was in the depression score. Bear in mind, we are talking about depression scores, so like larger negative numbers are better, so that's why the line is going down. So what you are seeing here is that the blue line, the escitalopram arm, behaves as normal. Patients who have higher expectations for the escitalopram treatment, they are doing better. There is the pre-treatment expectancy in the escitalopram arm is predictive of how well they are doing at the end of the trial. But the same is not true in the psilocybin arm. In the case of the psilocybin arm, there is no relationship between pre-treatment expectations and how they are doing at the end of the trial, which is a very surprising finding because this relationship between expectations and clinical outcomes, this has been measured and validated for a very large number of interventions for a very large number of clinical conditions. So what's happening, it's not that the people in the psilocybin arm, sort of like their own personal biases are, or so their personal expectations are biasing the trial. It's not that they are getting like an extra placebo response on top of the true drug effect. It's almost like the opposite, that patients had a very low expectations for the escitalopram treatment, and they are getting like a nocebo response, which is leading to this larger separation between the treatment arms. So the next thing that I want to talk about is a very similar analysis, but instead of expectations, we are going to look at suggestibility. So these are the same graphs as before, but now on each panel on the x-axis, you see the suggestibility instead of the baseline expectations. And here, it behaves exactly the opposite way as I told you before. So in this case, suggestibility in the escitalopram arm has no relationship with the clinical outcomes, but when you look at the psilocybin arm, there is a very consistent and strong relationship that people who are more suggestible are doing better at the end of the treatment in the psilocybin arm. So this suggests that people who are highly suggestible are good subjects for the psychedelic therapy. So this is what I wanted to say with respect to the psilodep2 data. But before I move forward to the microdose related stuff, I would just like to emphasize a few points. So one of the most important points is that when I say that with macrodose studies, like blinding is very hard to do, it's not because like the clinical team is incompetent or anything like that. It's just the nature of the treatment. But remember that actually for the vast majority of interventions, the whole concept of placebo control doesn't make sense. So for example, when we are talking about something like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, we are not doing placebo-controlled trials on CBT because it would be obvious who is doing nothing and who is receiving therapy. Or similarly, for any meditation-based or exercise-based intervention, we don't do placebo control. Placebo control as a concept only works for a very small subsection of all interventions, and they happen to be the pharmacological intervention, when you can just either give the active pill or an inactive pill to the person. So the model only makes sense in that context. And I think it is confusing with psychedelics because psychedelics are obviously a pharmacological intervention, but it happens to be a pharmacological intervention when blinding is just not going to work because of the very, very strong subjective effects that these substances are eliciting. So I think there's like a kind of like an interesting discussion point here with respect to how do we want to approve these drugs, because the classic model of double-blind placebo-controlled studies is just not working here. And right now, regulators are still asking us to do these trials, knowing that there is just zero reason to really run the placebo control arm in these studies because everybody will figure out, but it's taking up a lot of the resources because half of your patients will be randomized to the placebo control arm, and you can learn very little about the treatment in that arm in this instance. So next what I want to do is a little bit selfish because I'm going to advertise a method and a questionnaire that we have been developing. And it's in the context of microdosing, but conceptually it's going to also work for macrodosing. So we've developed a statistical pipeline that can take data from your clinical trial. And if you have this guess data, the treatment guess, from that we can calculate what would be the outcome of your clinical trial if it would be perfectly blinded. So I said the correct guess rate is a metric of the blinding quality. 50% is perfect blinding. With macrodose, we are about at 94%, which means that unblinding was very wide in this study population. Microdosing is an interesting in-between case. There it is about 70%, which means that blinding was broken, but it is salvageable. So what I'm going to show you is data from the self-blinding microdose trial that I did together with David Erizzo. And one of the cool stuff about that study is because of its citizen science approach that it is a very, very large data set. So here I show you the PANAS. PANAS stands for Positive and Negative Affection Scale. So this is a standard measure of mood. And this is a pretty complicated figure, but I want to walk you through it because I think this is freaking cool. So on the x-axis, you see this correct guess rate. And there are two important points on this axis. The green dashed line that is at 72%, which is the correct guess rate that we have observed empirically in the trial data. The black dashed line is at 0.5, which corresponds to a perfectly blinded trial. Now with the y-axis, there are two y-axes. One of them with blue, that is the between treatment p-value, and the red one, that's the effect size. So how many points is the between treatment difference? And you see this pinkish purplish horizontal line that is just drawn at p equals 0.05, so corresponding to the traditional significance threshold. Now the reason why I think this is really, really cool, because if you look at it, the blue line intersects the green dashed line below the significance threshold. So if you analyze the data with completely ignoring blinding quality, then you are concluding that there is a statistically significant placebo microdose difference. However, if you're following up this line to where it intersects the black line, you can see that if the study would be properly blinded, if the correct guess rate would be 0.5, then there would be no difference between the two, between placebo and microdosing in this case. How this works, it's a bit complicated. I did not want to talk about it. If you want to get geeky, come and find me. I am more than happy to tell you the details of how this method works. We can do the same for macrodosing as well, but one of the downsides of this method is that it's fairly data intensive. So if you're running a psychedelic trial, then please consider using the questionnaire, the Yes of Treatment questionnaire that we have developed to measure blinding quality in psychedelic and other trials. You can find that measure in the supplementary materials of this preprint. It's currently undergoing peer review. Okay. So that's what I mostly, so one more thing I wanted to say about microdosing. So the interesting observation with microdosing is that microdosing is definitely doing something, otherwise nothing explains why the correct guess rate is higher than what you would expect for a blinded study. But in this study and in other studies as well, it seems that if you're adjusting for blinding quality, then all of those positive effects are going away. So I think what it suggests is that one way of thinking about microdosing, it's like an active placebo, an intervention that definitely has an effect, but something that is not related to mood benefits. So microdosing definitely has an effect that allows participants to distinguish it from placebo, but however, that effect is not directly related to increasing mood or other reported benefits. So this one I'm not gonna go into. I don't really have the time. So I just want to give you this final summary of what I talked about. So with macrodosing, the cool finding is that there seems to be no relationship between pre-treatment expectancy and clinical outcomes. Now, this is a surprising finding, as I said, and if it stands the test of time, then actually it is really, really good news for psychedelic therapy, because then it would be a way of answering all of those criticisms with respect to the hype and the lack of blinding in these trials. As I said, this is very counterintuitive in terms of what we know about expectancy in general. So I'm somewhat cautious about that result, but let's see if it replicates. Yeah, so with respect to microdosing, I think you can make a solid argument that it can be conceptualized as active placebo, at least in a healthy population, which is what we had in the self-blinding microdose study. And really the most important point is the one that I have highlighted with red, is that just please bear in mind that just because you have a placebo control group in a trial, that doesn't mean that you're really controlling for the placebo effect. You're only controlling for the placebo effect if you have if you can show that participants were genuinely blinded. And the way to do that is to measure the blinding integrity via this correct guess rate mechanism. And we have developed this questionnaire, which we think is the optimal way of capturing such a data. So if you're running trials, please consider using this or some other similar questionnaires. Thank you for your attention.